Chapter 14, we're going to build our first real macroeconomic model. And it can get a little confusing, so we're going to go through it slowly. But what we're going to do then is to see, how one person's decisions, or really a whole group of people's decisions, can affect the whole economy, and also especially look at the role of government policy in terms of how government spending and taxes can affect the economy as well, especially during a recession. So aggregate demand, remember, is made up of those spending categories: consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, exports, and then minus imports. And that can fluctuate due to both consumption decisions and investment decisions, as well as external factors. But especially in a country like the United States, consumption and investment are going to be the main drivers of recessions. And sometimes those decisions can destabilize the economy. Remember, one person's spending is another person's income. So if a whole bunch of people stop spending, whether that's households or businesses, then income goes down and employment goes down, and we end up in a recession. And so then the question is, how, if at all, can the government stabilize the economy? When might those policies be more effective? When they might be less effective? And how can we build this model and look at the linkage between output and unemployment? So if we look at government revenue as a percent of GDP or GNP, and GDP growth, we can see that GDP growth has been less volatile than it used to be. So after World War II, we can see that we still have these ups and downs of the business cycle, right? Periods of expansion and recession, but they're not as large as they were at the end of the 19th and early parts of the 20th century. And part of the reason for that is that government spending has been a larger part of the economy. So this is the United States, and you can see that government spending is around 30% now, whereas it used to be, in the 19th century, it was less than 10%, and then it was sort of less than 20% up until World War II. So we're going to think about how we can model both aggregate demand and then put the government into that picture to see how that works. So aggregate demand, remember, one person's spending is another person's income, and that's what this model is all about. We're going to put production or income on one side and spending on the other side. And so aggregate demand, our C plus I plus G plus X minus M, if some of those groups spend less, then that can result in lower income for everybody else. And that can get amplified through the multiplier. And the multiplier basically just says that if I start spending less, then firms don't need to produce as much. They don't need to hire as many workers. That means the income of those workers goes down. That means that they spend less. That means that firms need to produce less again, et cetera, et cetera. And so we call this the multiplier effect. And it can be both negative in terms of recession, and it can be positive in terms of expansions. And if the total change in GDP is equal to the total initial change in spending, then the multiplier is 1. But usually we think, especially during recessions, that the multiplier is greater than 1, so that an initial change in spending will have a larger than 1 effect. And so we'll talk about why that is in this chapter. So the first thing we're going to start with is an aggregate consumption function. So remember, aggregate just means total, right? We're totaling up consumption across all the households in the economy. And we're going to have a very, very simple aggregate consumption function. We're going to say it just depends on 2 things. One, we're going to call autonomous consumption. That's just the amount of consumption we would have if our income was 0. And we're going to assume that that is greater than 0. We need to consume something in order to live. And then we're going to assume that consumption increases as our income increases. And now remember, we can think of this as a household, but really this is for the whole economy. So we're saying as the economy gets richer, as the economy gets more income, then aggregate consumption goes up. And the slope of that line, we're just going to assume it's a straight line for this simple model, is going to be called the marginal propensity to consume. Remember, the slope is the rise over the run. So you can think of the marginal propensity to consume as how much consumption changes when income changes by $1. And for the most part, we're going to assume that that marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. So for every extra dollar that the economy gets in income, it consumes less than $1 in consumption. It's gonna, of course, when we're talking about the whole economy, right, with 150 million households, the marginal propensity to consume is going to vary a lot. So poor households that are constrained by credit and don't have a lot of income are going to have a large marginal propensity to consume. It might be 0.8, 0.9, it might even be 1, right, where they consume any extra income they get because their consumption is low enough that they feel like they should consume every extra dollar of income. On the other hand, for wealthy households, their current income doesn't really matter that much in terms of consumption, right? So if they get an extra $100, they might not spend any of it, right? So their marginal propensity to consume is going to be small. It could be 0, it could be 0.1, 0.2. And so what we're looking at is the aggregate marginal propensity to consume, right? The total sort of weighted based on income. And so since higher household, there are more poor people, but higher house income households have more of the income. We should keep that in mind. And then anything else that affects consumption is going to be captured in that autonomous consumption, what we called C0, right? Whereas C1 is the MPC. So expectations about future income, wealth, changes in wealth, all of that gets captured in autonomous consumption. And so what kind of consumption changes? Well, here we have a graph that looks at both real disposable income, right, in the blue line. And you can see that real disposable income in this last recession didn't actually go down by that much. It went down from an index value of about 102 down to maybe, 99. But then it was back and just sort of bounced around. But real consumption of non-durable goods fell. So remember, non-durable goods are everything from clothing to food, etc. But real consumption of durable goods, those goods that are supposed to last more than 3 years, things like cars, things like refrigerators and washing machines and dishwashers, all of those things, that fell by 10%, right? From 100 down to 90 and stayed low for a while. And so durable consumption is a little bit more like investment. Remember how we said investment was more volatile? Well, durable good consumption is a lot more like investment because those things provide services for a longer frame of time. So if you decide, all right, well, I'm worried about the economy, I'm not sure about my income, I guess I'm not going to buy that new car that I was going to buy, and I'll just get by with a bus pass or my old car or whatever, then you can still survive, right? Whereas you can't say, okay, I'm not going to eat this month. That's not going to happen. So consumption of durable goods is much more volatile than consumption of non-durable